Hello and welcome to the Iron Brew Turbo Cider Retrospective. Today we are going to look and compare our bad batch, batch A, which used syrup, and our good batch, batch B, which used the original Iron Brew. However, both did turn out very drinkable, just very different approaches, very different drinks. Let's zoom right the way out and just look at the allocation of costs before we sort of dig into some of the details. The bad batch did come in at 65% of the total costs being fermentables. We then had an initial 17%, which was the yeast, of which there were a couple of yeast additions, and then we had other ingredients adding up to the final 18%. Total cost though was quite high. This came in at £21. Meanwhile, the good batch, the breakdown was very different, as you can see. Fermentables really did account for 90% of all costs. That really is what you are aiming for in something like this type of recipe. This yeast then, of which there was only one addition, was a mere 3%, which was 26 pence. This is hardly noticeable. And then finally some other ingredients like the nutrient for the yeast coming in at a final 7%. These two brews could not be more different, and that also is represented when you drill down further into the actual recipe, because although the base recipe was almost identical, the primary ingredient here is the same. It is apple juice and it is that safe cider yeast, so that is common in both homebrews. However, for our original bad batch, we then had lots of problems. The preservatives that existed in that syrup caused us all sorts of issues and needed multiple interventions before we managed to get fermentation off the ground, which we did, and we did get a good end result. None of that was necessary in the good batch, and it was a lovely, simple fermentation, great yeast, very fast, fantastic end result. So the costs overall were just absolutely night and day. I did start the bad batch with a view that this was a fast track version, and it really was not. So that hypothesis was disproved absolutely by these two brews. You know, at the end of the day, it's all about show me the money, and the price per pint is what really matters. And these are astronomically different prices. Our bad batch comes in at £3.08 per pint for one of those brews. I don't think I would pay £3.08 for what we got as the end result. However, I would pay £1.14 for the result that we got in the good batch, and that comes down to it. It's about value for money, and the good batch, keep it simple, spot on. While I'm presenting here today, I'm not actually drinking one of the ciders, which I typically would. I have today been taste testing and evaluating the Punk IPA, so I'm going to enjoy one of those. Now this glass is actually 500 millilitres, not a pint, and I would typically drink a 500 millilitres. So what would that be for the turbo cider? For our bad batch, it would be £2.71 for one of those, whereas for our good batch, it would be £1.01. Again, there's no competition. I really would have gone for the good batch. Live and learn. Vital statistics comes next. And here it is an interesting dilemma. So the syrup, which potentially I used too much syrup. So maybe I should have halved the volume of syrup. But nonetheless, even with some dilutions and interventions and everything else that happened, the original batch came in at 9% ABV, which was really nice. I do like occasionally brewing a strong brew, and this certainly made the bill. I'm not unhappy with the 9% end result, but I confess the 5% good batch was much more quaffable. Now let's have a look at those original gravities. I mean, they are night and day. 1.070 for the syrup. Now this actually came in at 1.090 prior to the interventions, and then we diluted further to try and get fermentation to start, and that's why it finally comes down to 1.8. 7.0. That really could have been much higher than we ended up with. You know, I'm not complaining. I am liking that batch also. Now, also very interesting is, as expected somewhat, because it's the same yeast, the final gravity came in about the same, 1.002 for the good batch and 1.001 for the bad batch. So in terms of the level of dryness and sweetness that you were expecting in the drink, they were both coming out very, very close to one another. It comes as no surprise then, these were small batches that we had 4 litres in the fermenter, and carbonation did work slightly differently, only in so much as I keg carbonated the good batch and I bottle carbonated the bad batch, and that was just for convenience at the time. I like both approaches. For a while I preferred the keg carbonation, but that isn't without some degree of risk, and there is a certain amount of simplicity and convenience that goes along with bottle carbonation that means I occasionally use that instead. Moving on to our schedule. Now that again I did multiple interventions on the bad batch, which meant that we were nearly a full 3 months end to end. We had 21 days of failed starts, which is why I'd started batch 2. I'd figured this is doomed, it's never going to ferment, I'm going to try something different. Shockingly though, after all of those multiple interventions, we did get a result, and actually the fermentation, once it started, it did ferment in 7 days, and we then transferred to a secondary vessel for a further 5 days to try and help with some of that clarity. For both batches we did a cold crash, which took just 3 days, and then once again, just true to name, our bad batch just did not want to bottle carbonate, and I tried it multiple times before we finally got to the sudden, oh my god, this carbonation is brilliant, but that took 50 days. My lesson learned over all of this is sometimes it is just a case of patience. Fortunately, our good batch, which I'd also stuck in a keg to help with carbonation, was really, really quick. We had 11 days in fermentation, 3 days in cold crash, straight into the keg, which was there for 9 days, and it was absolutely wonderful. It was 23 days end to end, and I did counter pressure bottle fill a few into bottles to share with friends, but I did actually drink most of those myself. Once again though, as we reached the final result, it was night and day. While I would say the bottle carbonation was below average, I have to say I loved the simple one, the one that was the cheapest and the one that actually just went so smoothly end to end. The end result was quite sweet, and that is because I used the Iron Brew sugar free, which ended up with non-fermentable sugars coming through to the final result, giving you a slightly sweeter end result. I am going to try the non-sugar free version in the future, so I can feed back and tell you the difference between the two. I personally liked that extra sweetness, but I do think there is a slight preference for a little drier, less sweet result, and I can understand that. I think I would enjoy that. Hence, look out for homebrew number 50 something, because we're going to come back to the Iron Brew Turbo Cider. So for the bad batch, the aroma was slightly off, it was slightly acrid, but for the good batch, I think we were near perfect all the way through. Which means when we finally look at the total end result, this feels pretty harsh, but actually the good batch was up there with the California Common, 2 of my favourite drinks for 2025 so far. And our fake Iron Brew, our bad batch, definitely currently the strongest in the table because it's holding everybody else up. Time for lessons learned. Oh my god, where do I start? I need a drink. Where do I start? I know, lesson number 1. Let's start with that Safe Cider TF6 yeast, Tutti Frutti as it's sometimes called. I think this is a winner, and I'm going to try some more ciders with this one. I've always been a big fan of using Nottingham yeast for ciders because it does help to bring out those fruity flavours. However, I do think Nottingham finally has some competition from TF6. I am very impressed for both batches really in terms of how that yeast turns out, which is probably a relief given that I now have almost 500 grams sitting in the fridge. Lesson number 2, a recommendation that links directly to that TF6, is diammonium phosphate, in using that as a yeast nutrient above perhaps what I've used more frequently in the past, which is formato. I do have DAP sitting in my cupboard, so it was an easy addition and used that for the primary yeast nutrient. Lesson number 3, and this relates primarily to our fake iron brew, which is effectively we measured this one in seasons instead of days. I went through winter and spring before we got to the end result. However, it was interesting to look at all of the possible interventions, most of which we tried, one we didn't. So in order of priority, we looked at giving it a good old shake to see if that could re-agitate and re-engage the yeast. We added more yeast and more yeast nutrient, both again to try and encourage things along. We created a yeast starter. That was interesting. This was a cider yeast starter, which means the yeast has gone through that growth phase before we introduce it into the main fermentation. So it's already active and going before we add it to those preservatives, and that can help overcome the problem that we experienced with those preservatives. Now, oddly enough, that didn't quite work, but obviously worked well enough to get us through to our final intervention, which was to simply try and add a little bit more yeast, a little bit more nutrient, and give it all a good shake. And we've got there and it started up, but there was one additional item that we could have tried, and that was to add a strong yeast such as EC1118, a champagne yeast, another yeast I've used quite a lot and I do quite like because it's a very clean fermentation, and that would have been a final option we could have tried. I think I might have given up though. I'm not sure I was in a mindset ready to go quite that far, so I'm pleased that it did restart when it did. Lesson number 4 is back sweetening, and here we have 2 different types of lessons. I was expecting to back sweeten both. Now, I didn't back sweeten the good batch because there was all those non-fermentable sugars sitting around giving it plenty of sweetness, so I didn't need to add it in that example. I did add it to the bad batch, and I probably just pitched the amount. I was actually genuinely being a little cautious. I normally provide a little bit more sugar for back sweetening than I did on this occasion. I wish I'd stuck to what I normally did. So lesson learned, stick to the 250 for back sweetening. That does seem to be a sweet spot. Lesson number 5 is gelatin. I've not used this before, so it was a new experience to have to dissolve it and add it in. Now at first, it didn't really seem to add a lot of value, but once again, I think the overarching lesson learned for the problem batch was certainly patience, because given patience we did get there in the end, shockingly, but initially I did have some concerns it wasn't working. However, end result, gelatin for us was a success. It just took a bit more time than other approaches I've used. Lesson number 6 is mouthfeel. Now here's an interesting fact, because mouthfeel was very different in both, and the bad batch was actually quite good. And I did add those tea bags to create the tannin in the beginning. I do think their absence, which was just a simple error on my part from the good batch, actually did reduce the quality of the mouthfeel. Overall, I liked the mouthfeel for the bad batch much more than the good batch. Ta-da! Lesson number 7, which probably should be lesson number 1, don't fucking try and beat preservatives. You're gonna hate yourself. Never mind. Lesson learned. Which does lead us to the more positive side of lesson number 8, which is with perseverance and a bit of patience, you probably can get there in the end. We did, but it would have probably been better to have just not tried in the first place. Lesson number 9, still focused on the bad batch, is it's absolute bonkers that it's 4 times longer to create an end result compared to following the simpler path. It's just that obvious. Unless, of course, that is, we come to lesson number 10 and you do like a strong ABV. This is a good way to get a strong ABV. I think if you just simply add lots of sugar, it would have thinned out. It just would not have been quite the same as using the syrup. So there you go. If you really want to get hammered, this is the way to do it. Our final lesson learned, just focusing back on the good batch, was that concentration of iron brew, which went very, very smoothly. It was actually simpler than I thought. I put it off using the syrup thinking that was going to be a pain in the neck. It wasn't. I should have just done that the first time. Ha! That's why these are lessons learned. Wow, this has been an absolutely epic journey and I have enjoyed it all the way. I am going to do the 1901 recipe iron brew as a future recipe which doesn't contain the non-fermentable sugars. That's going to be an interesting variation on all of what we've seen here. But I do appreciate all your listening in. For those who have made it this far, thank you very much for watching. Please do like and subscribe. Please do drop me a comment and any feedback. And until next time, cheers. Happy homebrewing. Good health. You can check out the Punk IPA coming up soon.